All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Faculty Forum, Navigating the Undergraduate Research Ecosystem at Brown. I am Oludurotimi Adetunji, Associate Dean of the College for Undergraduate Research and Inclusive Science. Undergraduate research is an high-impact educational practice that helps to strengthen and advance our student overall undergraduate education as they develop critical skills needed for future careers. Brown offers unmatched transformational opportunities for students to undertake research, internship, and engage scholarship locally and globally. Students are engaged in research within the curriculum or through co-curricular learning opportunities. Students can apply to research opportunities through the Sprint Undergraduate Research and Teaching Award, popularly known as UTRAS, to conduct incredibly interesting work in collaboration with faculty mentors. Undergraduate research projects are also supported through the Royce Fellowship, the Voice Undergraduate Research Fellowship, and the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Research Fellowship, among others. Additionally, students can also apply for funding to support their own initiated research projects through the Research at Brown grant. Many research projects conducted through these opportunities accumulate into thesis projects. Some students also contribute to the development of a new course or the revision of an existing course through their involvement in curriculum development research projects. Students also have the opportunity to share their research during the university-wide Summer Research Symposium or the Ultra Elevator Pitch event during the academic year. Furthermore, Undergraduate Research Office, in collaboration with the Science Cartoon Program, have developed animated videos focused on important topics related to research, such as what is research and research ethics. And these videos serve as tools that are available to our students, especially those getting ready for their first research project. Through undergraduate research, students are engaged in research projects to deepen the exploration of their own academic curiosity that might intersect with their professors' research interest. 3 faculty colleagues who have mentored undergraduate students in research are here to provide some insight and guidance on the undergraduate research ecosystem at Brown. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the faculty panelists so that they can join me on the stage. Kate O'Connor Gies, Provost Professor of Brain Science and Associate Director of the Center for the Neurobiology of Cells and Circuit at the Carnegie Institute for Brain Science. Professor O'Connor Gies' research focuses on how neutrons communicate. She and her team are particularly interested in how neurons build synaptic connections that reliably control behaviors while maintaining the ability to modulate their function over a lifetime of new experiences and environment. A research lab pioneered CRISPR genes editing in fruit flies, an important and widely used model system for studying fundamental biological processes conserved in humans. Join me. James Russell, Senior Associate Dean of the Faculty, Professor of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. Professor Russell is a geochemist, planet ecologist, and climate scientist with broad interest in climate and environmental change in the tropics. His research group uses lipid biomarkers, organic compounds, preserved in sediments to reconstruct temperature, rainfall, and ecological change in tropical Africa, Southwest Asia, and South America. They have pioneered techniques to reconstruct continental temperature and use a variety of stable isotope methods alongside climate models to reconstruct spatiotemporal variation in rainforest temperature and the impact of climate change on ecosystem. Jim, please join me. Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve, Associate Professor of Sociology and an affiliated scholar with the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, Illinois. She is an award-winning author of the book, Crook County, Racism and Injustice in America's Largest Criminal Court. She has provided legal commentary on the criminal justice system for MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, NBC News, CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. Professor Gonzalez Van Cleve's research is motivated by a central concern, theoretically challenging conventional pyramid, driving the study of race and racism, and placing those concerns squarely in the mainstream of sociology, as well as the subfield of law, organization, and cultural sociology. A new book examines race and wrongful conviction in the US. Please join me, Nicole. Okay, so our very first question for the panelists. So I will ask the panelists a couple of questions. Once they've exhausted my question, we'll open it up to the audience to also ask questions. So the first question is, could you share your research expertise and speak about the ways you have engaged undergraduate students as collaborators in your research? Okay, let's go Kate first.
Is that working?
Yes.
Okay. As you mentioned, we study the brain, so we're interested in neuronal communication and the way that happens at the level of the genome. So we're interested in identifying genes that are important for making synapses that connect neurons and maintaining them for a lifetime and altering their function during things like learning and memory. And so one of the approaches that we take in my lab is so we work in a model system, a genetic model system called Drosophila, which is fruit flies. And so what we do is we knock out genes we think might be important for these processes, genes that are conserved all the way to humans, and then we have various ways to see if we've disrupted synapses. This work is almost entirely undergraduate driven. So we have teams of undergraduates who do these screens.
Okay. Did you engage in undergraduate research?
Me?
Yeah.
We're just gonna, okay, so yes, no, I did not. I engaged in research as a master's student. So I actually, I was an economics major as an undergraduate. Wow. Then I worked for 2 years and I changed my mind. And so I ended up in a master's program, very luckily, and really with just having taken the basic science classes, I had little exposure to research. I just fell into a neurogenetics lab, and that's how I became a neurogenetics. I fell in love with that approach.
Thank you. Jim?
Hi, everyone. I'm broadly interested in understanding climate and environmental change. We take a lot of different approaches to that. I've always been I don't know, jack of all trades, master of maybe one if I'm lucky. The way I think about climate and environmental change, especially in tropical regions, the tropics are already the warmest place on Earth, and we don't really have modern analogs for what they look like in the future. We can't go find a warmer tropics, and so we look to the past. Times is in the recent geological past when global climate was warmer than the present day. We try to understand how temperature variations and rainfall variations happened, what processes drove those. That's a lot of climate science, so atmospheric physics, this sort of thing. And then we try to understand how those changes impacted terrestrial ecosystems. Did the Amazon burn more, for instance, when climate was 2 degrees warmer? These are the kinds of questions that we try to go after, and we use a lot of really complicated chemical approaches to try to unpack all of that. The way I've engaged undergraduates, the research is diverse, and so when undergraduates come and they would like to work in my lab, and I love having undergraduates come and say, hey, I'm interested in your work, could I get involved? I try to understand what their goals in their research are and try to figure out projects that interest them. Some of that's computational research, some of that can be chemical research. We do a lot of field work too. We go all over the world and kind of sample these sediment sequences. So there's a lot of different kind of things that we can do to get students involved.
Nicole.
Hi, everyone. First off, it's lovely to see all these parents here. Last year I had parents come by, like students brought their parents to meet me, and it was like the biggest honor, so thank you for being here. So in my work, I study law, and we don't have a law school here at Brown, but no worries. I am an empiricist, so I'm a sociologist that looks at laws and lawyering, and I think about the social forces and dynamics that construct our understanding and our experience of the law. And so I end up getting a ton of students that are pre-law, but are curious about, not just reading the laws, because we know they're experienced in humanistic ways, right? We could have a million rule books why police are not supposed to be shooting people that are unarmed, and we have rights and protections, but yet we see systemic violations of people's human rights and very little accountability. So I look at those tensions. For me, I think about engaging undergraduates in 2 ways. One is I have a class called Mass Incarceration in America, and in that class we've added a laboratory component, which is, we call it the Mass Incarceration Lab, and what we're doing is we're preserving the archival testimony of what currently incarcerated people are experiencing from behind bars. They are dying because after 40 years of mass incarceration, we have geriatric prisoners. They have been in there for most of their lives, some sentenced as juveniles. And so to me, it's imperative that we get their oral testimony of what they experienced. To me, it's very similar to capturing the narratives of enslaved people, capturing the narratives of Holocaust survivors. Unless we get their testimony of how these institutions are experienced, we're just getting it from the people that manage the system. And so my students are actively trained in ethics and research methods and how to perform oral histories, interview people. They're also preserving letters. They work with the John Hay to go kind of soup to nuts, which is looking at the letters, thinking about any ethical concerns, thinking about redaction practices, anonymity, moving that letter and coding it correctly so researchers can find it not just in a year or two, but in 100 or 200 years. We're thinking very much long-term, and then working with the librarians to make metadata so it can be found. So it really does have multiple components there. And then a lot of these students will follow me to other classes. So I'm teaching wrongful conviction in America right now. It's a small advanced seminar. And then those students will take on their own wrongful conviction cases and will replicate my methods, because in science we know that you're supposed to replicate and see that the patterns stay true regarding the cases that you find. And so they're really participating in their education to kind of be a contributor. And so that is the final project that they do. And then many of them go on to apply to UTRA, and that is where I see students soaring. I really just take on students that want to work with the core interest of the projects that I'm working on in the present moment. That's a book on wrongful conviction. And there are no little tiny projects. They are making, I would say, discoveries. I had one student, we had street files, which are buried files that the police hide in mass. In Chicago, but in other jurisdictions. And Lord have mercy, this student unearthed all the street files. Of course, I worked with her, told her where to go, who to talk to, et cetera. But they're doing like the investigative work that you could do if you wanted to jump on to an Innocence project. And so one of those alumni from my UTRA was hired in the Innocence project, and she was hired over someone with students with JDs. And that's because she could do the empirical work. She could translate it into grants for the organization. She could roll up her sleeves and pretty much play any role, everything from marketing and communicating the values of why wrongful conviction matters, but also, justifying in a grant why the organization should get money, why that's a worthwhile project. So that's kind of how I see it in a bunch of different ways. And students that are interested kind of follow you along. So it's really lovely to see students come to me as a freshman and then, get to meet their parents on graduation day. And it's emotional and it's lovely, and it's one of the best things about being a professor, So.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
So could you speak about your first research experience? I know that Nicole and Jim, you did do undergraduate research. Could you speak about those experiences?
Sure. My first research experience, as an undergraduate, I bounced around a lot between different labs because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I knew I liked research. My first experience was actually counting microorganisms in soils. And we were trying to figure out how sea level change was impacting, and the soil salinity was impacting different soil chemistry in the organisms that live in it. And I knew I liked kind of the thought of doing that. I didn't like doing it. And because I just found out, and I kept counting things too under a microscope, and for some reason it never dawned on me that I just did not like counting things under a microscope. Some people like counting that, but I don't. So I don't know. I did a lot of different things. I did that for a little while. I studied abroad when I was an undergraduate, and I actually did a project where I was climbing up trees trying to survey epiphytic orchids in different in these African mountains.
You have to be young for that, right?
Yeah, that did. I realized quickly that you might have a short lifetime on that one. So. But eventually I kind of found what I wanted to do, and I think what I learned from all those experiences is that I really liked research. It didn't necessarily kind of tell me what research I was going to do in graduate school, but I found I really enjoyed the whole process of discovery of it, and that was important to me.
Cool.
So I went to Northwestern University, and I will say that the infrastructure here at Brown is, to me, world class. I did a year at Harvard as a Radcliffe Fellow and did some work with undergraduate researchers, but the programs here are so well developed. And so I just preface that by saying at Northwestern there was one class for a social scientist called the Chicago Field Studies program. It allowed you to kind of work in a field site and design a research topic based on that experience. So this was great because I wanted an internship. I mean, that's kind of how I thought about it. I ended up working in the prosecutor's office, and slowly but surely I was, I kind of thought of myself almost like the Jane Goodall of lawyers and prosecutors. I was in there, I wore my business suit every day, and I'd be taking notes. And, they knew I was studying them. I was looking at gender dynamics, I was looking at organizational, apparatuses that drive courtrooms, really boring stuff. And then I realized that I was studying racism by accident, which is that as a light-skinned Chicana, the attorneys assumed me to be white, and they were disclosing how they felt about the people that they processed, the defendants they processed, their family members. So I was seeing egregious violations of due process and human rights. And as an undergrad, I didn't know that that was like a special finding, meaning I didn't know that people weren't reporting on this. I just kept, writing notes and writing field notes and kind of exhaustively. I remember being inspired by Harriet the Spy, which was a children's character. I thought of myself like that, Lois Lane, if you will. And that developed into the first field notes that would drive my book. And I just didn't know it yet, but I had these amazing mentors that were just curious about what I was finding and just keep going, keep going. So it was through that one class and then building relationships with other faculty that I truly kind of continued thinking about what research was in the social sciences. I was political science, but then changed to sociology. One caveat is I did do research on abortion rights and the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment was the banning of federal funding for abortions and a lot of women's health care, reproductive health care. It happened, I think, in like the 80s, early 90s. And one of my mentors was really interested in this, but I thought it was interesting, but if that's what I needed to do to like do research, it's like the same thing. Like I wasn't really interested in doing that. I probably would have given up. It was truly finding that spark, the thing that really ignited questions that I felt like I could continue asking until I retired, or maybe just keep pressing on. I just don't see an end in sight, that the curiosity would drive that passion. And it was through her that I saw myself as possibly being a professor, and that idea didn't even exist to me as a first-generation student. I don't understand. How do you get to be up in that lecture hall? I'm like, who gets there? Who does that? What road do you take to get there? And so that was kind of the mentorship plus the classroom was really where the passion ignited.
All right, thank you. So thinking about passion and the spark, what advice would you give to students who are interested in pursuing research opportunity for the first time? Kate.
We do wet lab-based research, so it's a little bit different. So I'll talk specifically to kind of the biological sciences that are based on wet labs. Although we do actually do computational projects too and have computational students doing research with us, but usually it's quite integrated with the wet lab. So my advice would be that the students take a little time, come here, take some classes, see the lay of the land. You can go to seminars in our department. We have weekly seminars where graduate students present their work. It's a really good way to get to know what's happening in all of the labs on campus. And gain some foundational knowledge, and then probably during their sophomore or junior year, after they've developed their goals, their interests. It doesn't necessarily have to be the question. You guys talked about, you talked about technique, you talked about question. I think a lot of times, neuroscience, you can study that like we do at the level of genes, or you can just study that at the level of human behavior. So it's a huge range, and that's just neuroscience. And so students really need to gain some experience to understand at which level you're really interested in studying. And that's what I lucked into in my first research experience. I didn't find the question I was going to address for the rest of my life, but I found the approach I was going to take. And so then once you find professors who are taking approaches that you're really interested in and, ideally addressing the questions you're most interested in, email them specifically. So really, go and talk to them, try to meet them. So make a focused effort rather than a broad effort, which we sometimes see students doing, which, I completely understand, they really want to get into a lab. But taking a more focused effort, I think is the way to go. And then the other thing that I would say is, if you wait until your junior or senior year, you can arrange your schedule at that point so that you have chunks of time where you can be in the lab. Because this is, really absolutely necessary for carrying out, what are multi-day experiments that take many, many, many hours. And so, getting a lay of the land, getting some of your big lab classes under your belt where you've learned a lot of these skills, and then coming into the lab and really being able to focus on something that excites you.
Gene?
Yeah, I would reiterate that part about time commitment. Research is a time commitment, and so I would advise students to make sure that when they decide they want to engage in research, that they're ready to commit the time to it. Able and ready. I mean, it's all about decisions. Where are we going to put our time? I think two things. One, many students don't know that all of us, we faculty, we're really excited to work with students. And so we love it when students come to us and say, I'm interested in your work. Are there ways that I could get engaged in research with you? It's very, very rare that the answer to that is, well, no, not right now. We almost always are able to kind of work something out to get students involved in research. And so my advice to students would be, don't be scared, just ask. I think the other piece of advice I would give is you're not making a lifelong commitment. You may decide you actually don't enjoy it, and that's fine. You learned something from that. It's very unlikely that the research you do here at Brown will necessarily be what you do. It might not even be what you do next year at Brown. But that's all fine. All of those are good learning outcomes. So many students feel like, well, I'm really worried about making a long-term commitment. It's not a long-term. It's a choice to try to get involved in research, and if you love it, then great. We can try to create an entire kind of long-term project that will be really impactful.
Nicole.
I'm going to start in a counterintuitive way. You can be high achieving, you can be really successful, and you do not have to do research. We might be a unique breed of people that like research. I admit that. It's okay not to like it. I had one student come to my office hours, and I said, "Oh, nice to meet you. Tell me about yourself." And the student said, "My mom saw you on MSNBC, and she said for me to come here." And I literally looked, like the Larry David theme song from HBO. I was like, dun, 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 dun. Don't do that. That's not good for you. I mean, if you don't love doing research, you're not going to have a great experience. It's going to be arduous for the student. It's going to be miserable. Like I said, I loved my mentor, but I didn't love her research, okay? It was a little sleepy for me. It was very archival. It was in the dusty libraries. I had to sit in these dark, I was scared a lot, in the recesses of the libraries where it's probably haunted. I did not want to be there. I wanted to be out doing stuff. I mean, I'm a crazy researcher. I'm outside jails at 3 in the morning. I am, and so I attract those types of students. I would say that the best way to meet professors is to go and be a great student. And if it's really a lovely class, if you're like, God, I want to know more, I want to read more. I've had students, there's suggested readings, and Tricia Rose, who was the head of the Center for CSREA, Center for, there's so many abbreviations here, Brown. Race and ethnicity, so the research on race and ethnicity. And she said she had suggested readings, and the student came back and they had read them all. She's like, I didn't get a chance to finish it myself. When the student is that passionate, it will be successful. I can easily teach them how to do what I do. But it is so exhausting when the student is not, they just know that they have to check it off on a resume. And I can guarantee you'll be very successful without doing research. People graduate law school all the time without ever seeing how courts work. It's also frightening, but that is the truth, right? It's okay. And so I just like to put that out there because, in this high-octane world, and parents are legitimately worried about getting jobs. I mean, I was worried about it as a first-gen student myself. I took 5 years off to work in advertising, to actually have an income, so that when I applied to a PhD program, even though it was fully funded, I had the stability enough to go and really enjoy the research and the work. And so I think that's, a good rule of thumb is that this can't be forced. So, talk to your student and see what their passion is. And then, it could be activism, it could be student government, it could be other things that will catapult them forward, but it doesn't have to be research.
All right, thank you. So how have you promoted a diverse research environment to make sure all undergrads feel welcome in your lab or in your research pursuit? Kate.
Okay. Well, we work really hard at this. We have, we usually have maybe 7 or 8 undergraduate researchers working in the lab. And so we work really hard to create a small microenvironment where they know each other well and where they work together, and so they have this that bonding experience. We do undergraduate specific journal clubs, for example. And then we also work really hard. I'm fortunate to have a lab manager who has a background in education. And so we have an entire program for mentoring the mentors. So in a wet lab, biological sciences environment, generally speaking, The lab has a number of postdoctoral researchers and a number of graduate students. And so the students on a day-to-day basis in the lab will be mentored by graduate students and postdocs. And so both for ensuring that the students have a positive and equally supportive experience, we spend a lot of time making sure that the graduate students and the postdocs have the mentoring skills necessary and also have support for helping students keeping their projects on moving forward. And then the other thing that we see that's really important about this is that those grad students and postdocs are going to be professors someday. And so this is foundational to their learning too. So we really try to emphasize that not just for us, but for every level of scientist, that the mentoring relationships are extremely important and extremely valuable.
Gene?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record because we do a lot of the same things in my group. I currently have 3 postdocs and 4 graduate students and about 5 undergraduates, and that creates a lot of sort of near-peer mentoring that can be really valuable on both sides of the relationship. I think the other thing we do is try to create an environment. My whole group gets together weekly to present research results, and there's no obligation, nobody's put on the spot, but it's just a very open environment in which people can present new ideas, and undergraduates present their ideas, postdocs present their ideas, I sometimes present my ideas, and then we discuss them as a group. And we really try to work very hard to make sure everybody understands in that group, much in the same way we do in classrooms at Brown, that any question is a good question, that all people should be respected in that group. And so, I think a lot of this just comes down to how people listen to each other and trying to create an environment that encourages listening and also encourages the free exchange of ideas.
So I think one thing that's already kind of baked into the system is that the UTRA program that's one of the best ways of undergraduates working with faculty. They get paid. It used to be this system of indentured servitude, if you will. When I was there, it'd be like, please, can I work with you, professor? And the professor would be like, yes, and it'd be free labor. And it's not always good, like that situation. And yes, there is some apprenticeship style, expectations, but that's not a free exchange. So the UTRA, I think, in some ways equalizes the field so that students that are first gen or on financial aid can expect a paycheck, and they don't have to have an additional hardship. And there's wonderful algorithms that help predict, I want to make sure that I get this right, but that in some ways don't reward the same student that's going through the program. And so that's sometimes been hard for me because you end up having students that you've trained and they're so good and you want to just keep hiring them, but then I would miss the new folks coming up. And so for me, based on my topic, I do get a lot of diverse students that have had incarcerated parents or parents that are civil rights attorneys. I mean, all different income levels, but certainly there is this passion. And so I do meet them in class, and there I can start saying things to them. When they ask me a question, I can say to them, I don't know the answer because no one has studied that. Maybe you can. And they'll look at me because they're a freshman like, what? And I'm like, you have 4 years to just think that thought, right? That's this amazing thing about college. 4 years to think a thought. Parents, do we get to think a thought for more than 5 minutes in the real world? No. So it's a very special time, but sometimes you need that person to stop and say, maybe you can be the person that studies that, right? And if it's in the classroom, you can really nurture that, and you can make sure that they understand, that some questions are very special, and sometimes they're born of their unique insight, whatever they came to Brown with, right? And that could be the incarceration of a parent. My first cousin was incarcerated, and that's what drove me back to study the same system. I was studying the system that he was prosecuted in, right? He spent the duration of his childhood in a system, in prison, and here I was going to Northwestern and studying that system, right? That is a calling, and so sometimes that really does, bring forward the student that truly has that passion, and it is diverse because it's based on that experience, especially in the social sciences.
Thank you. All right, so now I'm jumping a bunch of questions because of time, but I think I would like us to go to this next question. Can you share examples of successful undergraduate research projects that have had significant impact or societal benefit? Kate.
So I have a very recent example. So many of the manuscripts, I would say most of the manuscripts that come out of our lab have undergraduate authors on them. And so very recently, one of the genes that came out of these screens that are led by teams of undergraduates, who then in their later years can follow up on some of these genes, turned out to be a gene that is associated with a rare form of intellectual disability. So intellectual disability is genetically based intellectual disability is generally caused by a large number of genes with very rare variants in those genes. So it can be very difficult to study these because there are not a large number of patients for each individual variant. But what we found and what others have found is that by studying any one of these or a class of these, we're starting to understand what is changing in the brain. And so what types of mechanisms are affected, how are they affected, and how does that alter brain function? And so we recently published a paper on a quite surprising mechanism in PNAS. It's about the regulation of gene expression at a level that hadn't previously been understood. It also happens to involve modification of RNAs, and so I don't know if any of you are following this, but this is kind of a big next frontier in biology and certainly a major focus at Brown. And so what the two undergraduates, Shanze and Carlson, did was they found that they could create a model with fruit flies where we saw, when we disrupted this gene in the same way, that learning and memory was very severely affected. They then went on, based on mechanistic work that we did, to find that they could rescue this learning and memory disruption with antioxidants. So a simple, widely available approach. And so we're now trying to pursue this. So what they did was they provided the antioxidant throughout the entire development of the animal. And so now we have, Carlson is going back and trying to figure out at what stage do we have to supply this to rescue the learning and memory deficits, because we do know that there are developmental effects of these variants. And so he has pretty exciting results. They're preliminary right now, and so we think that this will potentially have a very big impact on clinical treatment.
Thank you. Jim?
It's interesting, I think about, I've mentored a lot of undergraduates, and I think often undergraduates come with an idea that they think, well, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but, and one of those that came to me recently, we've been doing a lot of work over the years in high tropical mountains looking at climate change impacts there, and a lot of that, we know that high tropical mountain, the Andes, the Kilimanjaro, all of the glaciers are melting, and there's a really complicated set of physics there, because why are they melting when the temperatures are never above the melting point? So there's a lot that we study just trying to think about the physics of that. And as part of that, we were collecting these sediment samples, and then, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, some of those high mountains started to experience really big fires. And an undergraduate came to me and said, how frequently does that happen? And it turns out nobody knows. And so we've started trying to work on the climatic conditions or the environmental conditions that can promote wildfire outbreaks in high tropical mountains. And it turns out that some of these places have never experienced a fire until the very recent ones, which really points to the combination of climate change and human impacts. And that can then speak to kind of how we try to implement fire management practices in some of these environments. And all of that came about because an undergraduate student said, how frequently does that happen? And so that was a really great outcome, and it's stuff that we've been working on now for a little while. The student has gone on and is now in graduate school. Published a paper on it as a lead author, and so but that's now a major thrust of my research group. So.
Nicole.
So I have so many examples. My students have touched my research in ways that I can never thank them. It's through conversation, it's through dialogue, through change. There have been times when my students have made discoveries, and my one student, Helena, she's the one that found these street files that were buried by the Chicago police. They affected hundreds of cases where people even were executed. And she ends up finding the old street files and unearthing tiny conversations that the police are having, disparaging both the black victims and the innocent boy that was charged with the crime. And I mean, just in these moments, you just are so proud, but you're also just in awe of what, if you empower them, what they can do. And so I always say, I never say no to a Brown student. If they have a crazy idea, I say, let's think about how that can happen. And my class, which is doing the archive, one student activist had a partnership with a state senator. And he's introduced this idea and said, they're collecting currently incarcerated people who are held in solitary in the state of Rhode Island. They're collecting their letters, talking about the inhumane treatment that they're experiencing right now. These are people in solitary right now. And I'm like, do you have possession of these letters? He's like, I can get that. I'm like, well, let's do that. Yes, and. It's like improv is yes, and comedy. But to me, that's the yes, and model of being a professor. He brought the letters to us. We archived them. And then we found out that the bill to remedy and possibly eradicate solitary confinement in the state of Rhode Island was coming up. And it was my students in this research laboratory environment. They said, we are going to represent every single person held in solitary. We are going to take those letters and we're going to testify. And they brought down that hearing until the depths of night. And I'm telling you, I was emotional because I couldn't be there. I'm a parent and I still have, school-age kids. And so I'm watching it on TV and I'm thinking, do their parents know they're on television? And I'm sitting there just like, I go, this is the best of what we could do in research. A sleepy archive that's supposed to be held at the John Hay Library that, you think someone's going to unearth in 200 years, and they are using that to change policy right now. It just doesn't get any better than that. And they didn't succeed. It's not like it's radically changed, but they did force an important dialogue, and the sheriff was really moved that he's trying to implement it in his policy, but the students want more. They want it codified into law. So when the sheriff is no longer in office, they can't go back to abusing people, putting them in solitary for holding on to an apple. That's what they were being held in solitary for. So that's the best of what I get to do here. Yeah.
All right, thank you. We'll now open it up to parents. Do you have questions, or anyone in the audience? Yes, sir. Then I'll come to you.
Hello. Thank you for the panel. This is really insightful and helpful. My student is a new freshman at Brown, and he did research throughout high school. So Brown held a special attraction to him because apart from being a research institution, this has a proportionately higher number of undergraduates, which probably results in more opportunities for undergrads. So he's quite excited. So one of the things I wanted your advice on is, since joining Brown, he has been reaching out. These are like cold emails to professors about potential research opportunities with them. so far hasn't heard back. So I'm assuming this is an atypical experience. So maybe some advice on, is there some protocol about how to identify professors, what type of information to put in the emails and such? Because I don't think this is an expected experience.
What area of research?
Broadly, neuroscience, mental development, neurodiversity, that kind.
I'll take this one, I guess. Yeah, so the reason I asked is because it does vary by field, and it varies by the type of research that you're doing. And so in the neurosciences and in the biological sciences in general, it is a little bit less likely to get into a lab as a freshman. And so that may be a factor. Your child should be getting responses from faculty saying that, and I'm a little surprised to hear that they're not, and that's unfortunate. But I would say, and I'd be happy to talk to them if they wanted to come by and talk with me. But again, spending some time getting to know some faculty, and maybe even one thing that sometimes people will do is, as a freshman, identify a lab that they're interested in and maybe start attending lab meetings, start doing some reading before they're able to get into the lab. We want to make absolutely certain that the students who enter have sufficient mentoring. And so, we really want them to be well supported once they're in the lab. And so, that does mean that we can't accept every single student who might come by into the lab. And so but we work really hard to try to make sure that the students find a lab that where they can do research that they're interested in. So I'd be happy to chat with them. I will say that in the neurosciences, we are actually instituting a new we're working towards instituting a new way of communication between the students who are interested in research and the faculty who have research positions available. It is a little ad hoc now, sending out emails, and we're trying to change that. In fact, we've got a student who is funded by an UTRA who is doing, your child should get this soon, who's doing a bunch of surveys to try to figure out how we can best do that. And so this is definitely something that we're thinking about a lot, and would appreciate feedback.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add one little thing here? My students are of a generation affected by the pandemic that they don't want to walk places to go and do things sometimes. And so I would say, too, the other thing is, make sure that they're going to the office hours, not just because, mom, told me to go or something like that. That was the worst scenario. But I love meeting new students. Sometimes they'll be like, hey, I'm a freshman. I'm so interested. I've read your book when I was in high school, and I just would love, what classes are you taking or teaching, and how do I get into that? And you're like, wow, this is a great student. You're excited to talk with them. I've never been exhausted by that. It's always wonderful. The problem is with the emails, it's almost like you got to imagine each professor that has a lab or grants. We're like these little CEOs of the corporation that we manage. It could be media response. It could be, managing the grants, IRB, which is our institutional review. There's always something going on. That becomes overwhelming. So when we get the cold emails, it's like I can't even respond to some of that. I even get emails from high school students. I'm like, can't do it. So I would encourage them to work on, and that's a great people skill too that they'll use for the rest of their lives. Just pound the pavement, Yeah. It's like that's important. Show your face after class. I used to talk to professors and ask additional questions when the class resolved, or adjourned, I should say. And that's a great way to meet your professors, but also the students that are also interested in what you're interested in.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add to that, I actually often have first-year students work in my lab. I've had people come to me in their first week and say, "Oh, can I get started?" Yeah, sure, why not? And we figure out something. It may simply be attending research group meetings to get a feel for what we do before we say, "Well, why don't you handle these irreplaceable samples?" So there's some stuff like that we try to spin up before you kind of let somebody fully loose. But Another pathway is to talk to departments all have directors of undergraduate studies, and setting up an appointment with them, because they can talk kind of more broadly about the research that's done in an academic department and give some insight into different professors who might be kind of at the time accepting new students into their research areas. And so that's another way to kind of do it more generally, especially for relatively new students who may not kind of know all of the different areas of research that they could get involved in a field. So.
Yeah, relatedly, I'd suggest getting involved in the departmental undergraduate group. They, for example, we work with them to have lab tours, so undergraduates can, go into a handful of labs and see what's going on there. We show them the microscopes and the electrophysiology rigs and stuff, and they can decide, do I want to sit at a microscope and look at pretty neurons, or would I rather be doing behavioral studies with humans? And so getting involved with the DUG is a really, I think, important thing for students to do.
I will also add that my office, the undergraduate research office, we do have templates that could help students when they are crafting this kind of emails. And we could also help guide the students. So I'll be happy to talk to your student as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your responses. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so on a basic level, for a student who wants to undertake some undergraduate research, is it done for credit, not for credit, paid, volunteer, in addition to classes, over the summer? Just where do they start?
It could be any of the above. It depends a lot on I would say, the student's commitment and when they're getting in, sort of where they are in their own kind of approach to research. In my area, some students initially volunteer. Not always. Sometimes we hire them outright. I'll say that the hiring process at Brown is an interesting one now. When we're hiring new undergraduate students into the lab, those are advertised positions that anybody can apply for. Often they originate because a student has approached us and said, hey, I'd like to get involved in work in your lab, and so we put out a job ad. People should apply for those because, if you see, if a student sees a project or an area that really interests them, it can't hurt to apply. I may not be able to hire 2 people immediately, but I might be able to hire somebody else, 3 months later or something like that. There's also this summer UTRA program that you've heard about that's a great pathway, and many students in their first summer or second summer take advantage of that. There's an algorithm to figure out how the pay scale works for that.
So I should say that it could be any of the above. They could do independent study research. They could apply for opportunities. So I would say that in the last year, about 25% of undergraduate at Brown applied into an UTRA opportunity. So just so you know how popular this is, 1 in every 4 students actually apply. So we've changed the process to make it more accessible. Right now, we're asking a lot of faculty colleagues to list their project so that any student can apply into those projects, and this has really helped the numbers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add that, like in my lab, for any given student, they almost always start taking either an UTRA or for credit, and then we work with them over the next years to make sure that they continue to be either funded or get credit for their work. And so, one of the big things that we do is we want to make sure that if we accept a student into our lab, that they can stay in our lab until they graduate and be supported.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question. Yeah.
I personally work at a high-tech company, and we love hiring summer interns from Brown. And my question is, how do you and the academic environment for undergraduate research integrate their research experience over with industry experience that they may get over a summer intern at a for-profit industry location?
So at Brown, the system called sprints It's the umbrella program for all kinds of opportunities within Brown and outside of Brown. So students during the summer, they could apply into one of those external opportunity and still get funded through Brown. So for example, if your industry, your company has opportunity, you could list those opportunity with us, or you could engage through our Center for Exploration to be able to allow students to have access to those opportunities, then they can apply. So there is a different mechanism for that. And a lot of students are also using that mechanism to be able to engage in research, not only in industry, but also maybe through other institutions that are engaged in research during the summer.
And I think to this point, like I've worked in corporate America before I got my PhD. And so, what I try to do is, we set up, it's called Monday Mission, Friday Finding. And they have to be ready. They get their marching orders on a Monday. And then, I am going to be expecting a certain, presentation about what they're finding, right? Friday Findings. But also, they work in teams, they collaborate, and I think one of the most important things that I tell all my students when they're done with UTRA is take your research experience. I want you to write down the bullet points that you're going to add to your resume, and then I want you to march over. I'll look over it. Then I want you to march over to the Career Center, because all those things that you worked on are they're a significant contribution to what you would bring to a corporate team, regardless if it's nonprofit or or anything. I mean, whatever environment it is. I mean, the other thing is that research in any industry has to translate to something actionable. So I'm always pushing them as they present to talk about policy change, whatever is the finding, like how do you translate that to the real world in some way, shape, or form? So you saw what happened in the class. I gave them the marching orders, and they say, well, wouldn't this be great to translate this into testimony in front of the Rhode Island State Senate? I mean, who wouldn't employ that student, right? It's you could see that the actionable, that they could take their education and translate it. So I do think our career services are wonderful because they actually help that beyond the professors that may or may not have that corporate experience. I do think the Career Center is supposed to help them translate that research environment, the lab experience, right, into something that they can communicate to employers.
Yeah, students often kind of can translate the direct skills. I learned statistics, I learned to code in Python, I learned, those things. It can be harder to think about, I learned to persevere in a really challenging environment. I learned to work as a team, I learned presentation skills. But those things are really, really important to employers as well. And so trying to help them kind of back up a little bit and think about the whole experience they got from research, I think is really important. And the Career Lab's actually really good at that.
They're very good at it. Yeah. I just wanted to kind of add, while we're thinking about careers and then going back to the question before, I think maybe we didn't underscore enough the importance of the summer UTRAs and what a wonderful opportunity those are for students. They're working, full time doing their research, which really, I think, helps them with making it gives them the time to immerse so deeply that they do start to imagine this as potentially a career path, and they start to really be able to take full ownership and focus on their research. And so I can't underscore enough how important the summer UTRAs have been for the development of the students in our lab, and I think they're just a fabulous opportunity.
And I had one more thought on this.
All right.
I tell my students, there's time for visionary thinking, and there's time for flawless doing. And I have this, and I share this memory. I was working at the White House in the Chief of Staff's office, and I had to, Xerox, some kind of packet for, Jesse Jackson or something ridiculous. And the darn copier broke. And I realized that nothing at Northwestern ever prepared me for such a crisis. It had nothing to do with the mind. It had everything to do with flawless execution. And I said, the best things you can learn is not just to be an exceptional visionary thinker, but how do you bring that into action? Are your citations perfect? Have you crossed all the T's and dotted the I's? So I try to teach them that both elements are going to be so important to their life's work and what they want to achieve, right? Are you the person that rolls up the sleeve and can fix the things when they're breaking, can be that person? And I think, labs are great places to figure that out. So.
So on that note,
Can I say one thing, Ludwig? Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Rashid Zia. I'm a faculty member in engineering and physics now, so I happen to have the pleasure of serving as dean of the college with these lovely panelists. I just want you to know, I think it was pretty obvious if you heard the enthusiasm with which they spoke, how dedicated Kate and Jim, Nicole, and Ludwig are to our students. They are 4 exemplars of the hundreds of faculty members that support undergraduate research at Brown. And I will share with you that I know students that have worked with each and every one of them. And so as you were asking questions about how, let's say, working with Nicole as a researcher has impacted the lives of students and their future careers, I can think about the researcher that Nicole helped prepare, who this summer was working at the State Department. So just know that there are hundreds of faculty members like them, but I would like you to join me in applauding Kate, Jim, Nicole, and Ludwig for all they do for our students.
Thank you.
thank you, Rashid. Thank you, parents and students, for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest sections that you've come for.